Donald Trump is losing the trade war with China, the same conflict he initiated. On October 30th, Trump met China's President Xi Jinping in South Korea, and the two leaders announced what is essentially a one-year truce. Not a peace deal. Not an end. Just a temporary pause. And that single moment revealed something the world had quietly suspected for months. The United States, for the first time in modern history, just backed down from a geopolitical battle it could not afford to lose. This wasn't the victory Trump promised his supporters. It wasn't the economic knockout he predicted. Instead, it exposed a reality Washington has been reluctant to admit. China has risen to become a true peer rival, capable of matching American economic firepower blow for blow. The tariffs, the shock and awe pressure tactics, the threats of 100% duties. None of it forced Beijing to kneel. In fact, China fought back harder, smarter, and with far more strategic leverage than anyone in the West expected. This one-year pause is not a ceasefire between a winner and a loser. It's a timeout taken by the side under pressure. And the evidence shows, this time, that side was the United States. For years, Americans were told that the United States held all the leverage, that Donald Trump's trade war would force China to bend. But the reality unfolding today looks nothing like that promise. The truth is that Donald Trump is losing the very trade war he initiated, a conflict he expected to dominate. The clearest proof came on October 30th, when Trump met President Xi Jinping in South Korea and the two leaders announced what was essentially a temporary one-year truce. It wasn't a peace deal. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't the total victory Trump had repeatedly promised. It was simply a pause, a momentary freeze in a conflict the United States could no longer escalate without harming itself. Before we break down the details of the agreement, the tariff strategy, the rare earth struggle, and the geopolitical fight over semiconductors, it is important to establish one fact upfront, because it frames the entire story you are about to hear. This round of the trade war was won by China. The Financial Times, one of the world's most respected financial newspapers, described China as emerging as a true peer rival to the United States. When Trump first launched this trade war during his first term, China was caught off guard, unsure how to respond to America's aggressive tariffs and political pressure. But this time, Beijing arrived more prepared, more self-sufficient, and significantly more powerful. As the FT wrote, China managed to fight its once mightier opponent to a standstill. And when you look at the data, you will see that this isn't an exaggeration, it's a precise description of what actually happened. When Trump launched his shock and awe tariff strategy, he believed the United States could simply overwhelm China into economic submission. Tariffs were raised to 145%, a nuclear-level escalation. Trump and his advisors were convinced China had no choice but to cave. They miscalculated. China retaliated immediately with identical tariffs, creating fear and uncertainty across American industries that relied heavily on Chinese imports. These retaliation measures were not symbolic. They were direct hits on U.S. manufacturers, tech companies, farmers, and supply chains. The pressure forced Washington to pull back before its own industries suffered deeper damage. When Trump escalated again, China pivoted to an even more powerful weapon: rare earth elements. These are resources the United States military and high-tech industries desperately depend on, minerals essential for fighter jets, missiles, electric vehicles, and advanced electronics. China's export controls sent shockwaves through U.S. defense contractors and technology firms. Trump had no counter to this move. When the U.S. expanded its export controls on Chinese tech companies and thousands of their subsidiaries, China tightened its rare earth controls again. And for the second time, the U.S. retreated. It struck back with equal and often greater economic force. BNP Paribas summarized it perfectly. The United States is now dealing with a peer rival capable of imposing material economic harm. That statement wasn't just analysis. It was confirmation. The agreement reached this year wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't reconciliation. And it definitely wasn't the victory Trump tried selling to his supporters. It was simply a pause. A freeze. A temporary cooling of tensions before the next escalation. Most of the punitive measures were suspended, not removed. Chinese scholars describe the agreement as a temporary thaw, and they're right. This isn't the end of the trade war, it's the calm before the next storm. When Bloomberg analyzed the deal, they created a careful scorecard comparing U.S. concessions to China's. The results were not flattering for Washington. The U.S. agreed to lower fentanyl-related tariffs from 20% to 10%. It suspended a planned 50% expansion of the U.S. entity list. It backed away from Trump's threat of 100% blanket tariffs. It postponed ship fees. These were major concessions. Meanwhile, China offered far less in return. It loosened rare earth controls, but only temporarily and with full power to reinstate them whenever it chooses. It resumed soybean purchases, something it had already been doing quietly. It agreed to a vague, non-binding discussion on buying U.S. energy. It offered additional restrictions on fentanyl-related chemicals. And a possible TikTok arrangement remained unclear and non-committal. Bloomberg concluded that China gave up less and the United States gave up more. The Associated Press supported that conclusion, calling the deal a reversal of a self-inflicted trade war. Economists at Cornell University examined the agreement and found no meaningful gains for the U.S. economy compared to pre-Trump conditions. After months of escalating threats, tariffs, and political grandstanding, the U.S. ended up almost exactly where it started, except with greater economic damage. The core problem for the Trump administration was miscalculation. But that belief came from a world that no longer exists. China today is not the China of the 1990s, or even the early 2000s. It is a technologically advanced, highly diversified economy with deep global influence and considerable resilience. China's exports to the U.S. now make up only 10% of its total trade, meaning Beijing is far less dependent on American markets than before. Meanwhile, the United States relies heavily on Chinese-made goods it cannot easily replace. The U.S. depends on Chinese imports for cell phones, computers, advanced batteries, sophisticated electrical equipment, machinery, and a wide range of automotive components. These aren't plastic toys or cheap furniture. These are high-value technologies critical to the U.S. economy. The American manufacturing sector cannot simply recreate these supply chains overnight. In contrast, the products the U.S. exports to China, like soybeans, corn, crude petroleum, and some semiconductors, are far easier for China to replace. When the United States cut off food exports, China turned to Brazil and Argentina without hesitation. When the U.S. restricted semiconductor sales, China accelerated domestic production. The math is simple. The United States depends more on China than China depends on the United States. China's rise up the global technology ladder is a major reason America lost leverage. For decades, China invested heavily in industrial planning, manufacturing, and research. Today, U.S. industries rely on Chinese components across electronics, automobiles, machinery, construction equipment, agriculture, and even services. China's domestic consumer market is enormous, and it drives the majority of its industrial revenue. Even when China does export electronics, many are now moving through third countries, such as Vietnam and Mexico, making tariff barriers less effective. Economists warned early on that Trump's tariffs would end up hurting American workers more than China, and those warnings turned out to be accurate. Goldman Sachs estimates that American consumers pay roughly 55% of the cost of Trump's tariffs. Tariffs are essentially taxes on importers, and importers pass those taxes down to consumers through higher prices. That's a major reason consumer inflation in the United States remains sticky and elevated. Since April, the U.S. has lost approximately 42,000 manufacturing jobs, undermining one of Trump's core campaign promises. Businesses have slowed hiring and investment because tariff uncertainty has made long-term planning nearly impossible. Farmers, particularly soybean farmers who overwhelmingly supported Trump, were hit especially hard. When China slashed purchases from the United States and shifted to Brazil and Argentina, American farmers were left with massive surpluses and falling prices. Trump is now considering another $10 billion bailout for farmers, funded by tariff revenue collected from American consumers. In other words, Americans pay higher prices so the government can then compensate farmers for losses caused by policies that hurt them in the first place. Rare earth elements remain China's most powerful strategic weapon. The country controls more than 60% of global mining and over 90% of global refining. These minerals are necessary for fighter jets, guidance systems, missile technology, satellites, smartphones, and electric vehicles. The U.S. military cannot function without a steady supply from China. When Beijing restricted rare earth exports, U.S. defense firms panicked. Rebuilding a rare earth supply chain takes decades, not months. So why did Trump back down now? The midterm elections are 1 year away. Inflation is rising again. Manufacturing jobs are declining. Voters are frustrated. Trump cannot afford a collapsing economy while heading into another election cycle. His approval rating has fallen steadily throughout his second term, and an economic downturn would damage him even further. Even conservative think tanks have admitted that Xi Jinping held firm while Trump blinked. But make no mistake, this is not the end of the conflict. This is only a temporary truce. After the midterms, once political pressure eases, Trump may escalate again. The trade war isn't over, it's entering its next phase.